What's going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to dive into an Inman News article talking about how you can capture more buyers if you're selling your home this fall, especially now that the seasons have changed and we're outside of the school selling season. We're kind of in that no man's land in September and October before the end of the year. We're going to go through 16 things they feel sellers can do to entice buyers, especially if you're in a market where things are a little bit slower. And I'm going to give you my opinions as well of how I would approach those 16 things, if I think they're valid or what I may do a little bit differently. So let's take a look at what they got. So obviously this time of year can be tricky, especially depending on where you live in the country. Here in Atlanta, greater Atlanta area, we're kind of in that transitional season where people that were moving around the school year have already done so because school starts at the beginning of August. And we're also not quite yet to that fourth quarter surge where people are relocating ahead of the new year. So it's a time where sellers get a little bit antsy. There may be fewer showings. You want to do a little bit more to capture the buyers and make sure that you're actually appealing to the people coming through to get an offer. One of the nice things, obviously, that we're going through right now is as the interest rates do come down, it does allow more buyers to enter into certain price points. And that does alleviate some of the issues, especially if inventory has been a little tough to start going up. So one of the first things they touch base on is the inspections. Now, what do they mean by this? Well, typically, depending on the house and the situation, buyers will pay for their own home inspection. And with the home inspection, there are multiple different things you're looking for. You can have just the basic home inspection. We could be looking at a termite or pest inspection as well. Radon, there could be water intrusion, they could be scoping the sewer lines, especially if it's older or historical property in an area where there's a lot of trees and roots may be an issue. If there are pools, you could have a pool inspector come out. And a lot of those costs can add up for buyers, especially if we're in a price point where it's first-time home buyers, funds are tight, and all of those out-of-pocket expenses add up. So something you can do, you can actually offer to prepay the home inspection for buyers as a way to kind of just, they don't necessarily have a lot of skin in the game. Because speaking of in Georgia, for most contracts, we have a due diligence period here. In that due diligence period, a buyer can back out of the contract for any reason at all and keep their earnest money. Now, the length of that due diligence period is completely negotiable and something that would be on the initial offer. But if you're prepaying a buyer's inspection or offering that as some sort of incentive for them to put an offer forth, all you're really doing at that point is saying, hey, if we go under contract, we'll prepay for the inspection for you. It's no money out of pocket. And that way you get to see, what's behind door number one for the house. The problem with this is you're inadvertently tying your home up and pulling it off the market, whether it's an active under contract or pending status, thereby reducing the amount of other buyers that are going to want to take a look at it. And in that same time frame, the buyer isn't wholly committed because they don't have any feeling of value. They're getting something for free just to see if they want to move forward. A better way to approach this, and something I recommend for a lot of clients, is if there are concerns or general things in that could come up, I would almost recommend an owner goes ahead and has their own inspection done before even listing it. That way you can have the most up-to-date property disclosures possible, and you can also show them that inspection report on the front end. What that does is it does two things. You may gain buyers' confidence where they may bypass doing their own inspection depending on the detail of the one you provide, or they may even reduce the amount of days that they're requesting for due diligence or get rid of it altogether, and that's fantastic. The other thing it does is it gives people a peace of mind because you're being extremely transparent, and buyers are always weary that something is being hidden. As part of being transparent, you get the opportunity to fix things on the front end, and it's going to always cost you less to fix them as a seller than any amount the buyer thinks that they're going to cost to fix. They will always inflate those prices, and they will always want a larger credit. Now, because of this, you can show a report to the buyer, you can show a full list of everything that's been done, and it just gives a vote of confidence going forward to make everyone more comfortable and hopefully really solidify that offer and getting to the finish line. Now, the second most, well, I would actually say the most common thing we typically see being asked for or offered is closing costs. In a hot market, we see people pull back on closing costs a lot because they're competing with other buyers. They may be going over asking, so they don't want to ask for an incentive coming back. But as things start to normalize, especially at price points where they're first-time home buyers or it maybe isn't as competitive, buyers need assistance. They also want to minimize out-of-pocket costs. So what they're trying to do is reduce the amount of money that they have to bring to the closing table by asking for closing costs back from the seller. Now, especially in light of the lawsuit, this can actually supplement paying a buyer's agent commission if they have a contract in place with their buyer's agent that is different from what is being offered by the seller. They could request closing costs and actually use some of those closing costs to pay their agent as well. Now, the closing costs make it simple because the seller doesn't have to do anything on the front end, and it's also not out of pocket at the beginning. You're waiting until everything's being reconciled on closing day, and those funds are just coming out of the net proceeds. So it does become a little bit easier for owners to say, okay, we can give you this credit. We know it's not out of pocket. We'll make sure that we're actually closing and then agree to that. So first two, I think, are stuff we see a good bit. I would highly recommend. Number three, mortgage rate buy downs. Again, this is something that's become very common, especially the past year and a half, where interest rates have crept up. As they start going down again, we will start seeing this less and less because it becomes easier for buyers in general to get into the market. The nice thing about mortgage rate buy downs, and every lender is different, is the amount of money being spent on the front end to buy down the rate is usually pretty insignificant towards the amount of overall savings in the monthly payment and the long term, assuming the buyer stays in the house for a set period of time. So if buyers are forward thinking or they have a long-term outlook, this could be a great way to actually reduce future costs and get a higher spending power in the near term because they can qualify for more property at a reduced rate. So if someone's right on the level of being uncomfortable of what they can and can't afford, if the owner agrees to buy down the rate some bit, that will actually make those payments more palatable for the buyer and they can easily afford the house. Now, as far as additional lending incentives, there are some things that can get creative where a seller can pay a buyer's mortgage insurance, they can pay additional fees. Typically, we don't see this a whole lot. It usually gets wrapped into closing costs because that's the simplest thing for people to understand. And one of the tough things, especially on the buying side, is buyers don't necessarily know all the things that they can ask for. They don't know the terminology. Every lender operates a little bit different. So as a seller, if I'm putting something out there, I would typically just wrap it into closing costs and not worry a whole much from there. Now, home warranties, this is a hot button issue with agents because home warranty companies are designed to obviously take a monthly fee. There's going to be a service charge in place whenever something goes wrong, and you're at the mercy of them farming out that service call to a various provider that they have a relationship with. Now, I've had multiple home warranties on my own places over the years. I've had some good experiences with them. I've had some very bad experiences with them. Usually what you're trying to cover is a large ticket item that may be on the edge of its useful life. Now we're looking at something like an HVAC system, especially if the house has multiple HVAC systems and maybe they're 10 plus years old. The problem with that is HVAC systems, or pretty much any major appliance, will go out at the least opportune time possible. So now all of a sudden it is July in Atlanta, it's 100 degrees, your AC goes out. Well, you can have a professional out there that day or the next day replacing the system. Or if you're going through the home warranty route, it may be 3 or 4 days before a tech actually gets assigned, comes out to the property, then it has to go through all the channels of getting approval. They're going to try and replace minimal parts to minimize expenses first, before ultimately, if they can't do that, then they replace the unit. So it's a very long road to save a decent bit of money, and that's where you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. Now, knowing that, I think if you have buyers coming to your property that are first-time home buyers, or you do know that some of the systems are on the fence, it could be a decent way to get by having to do a larger closing cost credit. So I just recently closed a deal. Both of the HVAC systems were over 20 years old, which is very, very far past the useful life of what we would typically see. the seller actually prepaid a 3-year home warranty, and the buyer was willing to take that chance that they'll deal with the inconvenience of something going out at the wrong time because there are multiple levels of living in the house, and they also have 3 years to hopefully get something replaced for free that would cost tens of thousands of dollars if multiple units went out. So it is something we are still seeing. I feel like the home warranties were a lot more prominent a few years back. People have kind of become a little bit more weary of their usefulness, and we are kind of just in this age where if something happens, people just want to fix now. But again, it's not something that I would fully discount, and talk to your agent about it depending on the situation for sure. So repairs, as far as the house itself, this is something we touched on previously, where I encourage people that you're not going to be able to fix everything a buyer is looking for on the front end, and some buyers are willing to overlook certain things. So if you have the home pre-inspected, or you know something is going to be a major red flag, which your agent can help you figure out all of those items, it may be worthwhile addressing on the front end if it's something that you think buyers won't be able to overcome when looking at the house. Otherwise, a lot of times it does make sense to wait for the inspection to be done, see what they'll actually ask for, and then negotiate from there. Leased items, at least as far as I've come across in the past 10 years, is not something we typically see. I'm in an area where there's not a whole lot of solar panel usage, and a lot of the things that would potentially be leased prior are now just owned outright, whether it's car chargers or things that convey with the house, or the owner takes them with them. So this is not something that I would keep top of mind if I'm worrying about trying to secure a buyer. Now, as far as appliances go, it is usually pretty standard that sellers will try to either negotiate the fridge and the washer dryer staying, or keep them off of the seller's property disclosure. Most of the time, the buyers are going to write them into the contract and ask for them anyway. But if there's something that you're really attached to and you do want to take them with you, just know going into it that a buyer wants a home they can move into right away. They don't really want to have to be replacing appliances after paying for the house. Now, especially as you get into some of the more higher end appliances, this could be a big ticket negotiation. So definitely something to be mindful of and talk to your agent about. Prepaying HOA fees. This I actually like a lot, because it takes what could be a big hurdle for some properties and really put a different spin on it. Now, the past few years, we've seen insurance costs creep up exponentially for HOA associations, especially as they've been going through damage, they've had a lot of claims, and insurance companies are also having a tough time getting coverage where they need to because of an increase in natural disasters over the years. So what we typically see, if HOAs have been keeping up with inflation, they've steadily been increasing HOA dues over the years. I know that pains a lot of owners, but it's a necessary evil, especially if you're in a property and a community that you're trying to keep pushing property values up. Now, there are instances where the fees do get to an amount that seem pretty unreasonable for the area. There are unique circumstances. There could be fire damage in the community. There could have been flooding. They could have been at risk of not getting insured, or maybe they were just underfunded and misallocated budgets previously and they're playing catch up. So something like this, I actually own a rental in a community that I feel has high HOAs for the area. But if I was going to sell, I know that is a common objection that would come up. As part of the upfront marketing, I would actually think about offering to prepay a year's worth of HOA fees, maybe the initiation fee. If it's a luxury property, maybe you don't do that on the front end. You kind of wait until you have the buyers interested and then dangle that carrot a little bit. Property taxes as well. I don't typically see buyers asking for property tax credits. Normally, it's just going to wrap into the closing cost credit. If they do have a mortgage anyway, the property taxes get wrapped into that, and they kind of view it as out of sight, out of mind. On cash deals, they have been a little bit more common, especially if we're coming up to the point where the assessment is going to be due or it's tax time. Buyers may just factor that into a little bit more of the closing costs that they're asking for. Upgrades. This is a touchy one for a lot of people. Now, as far as upgrades go, this to me is the most complicated one because we are in an era where buyers expect homes to look like HGTV quality homes. And that's difficult because we live in our homes. Our stuff is out every day. They do get run down over the years, especially if you have kids or pets, and it's hard to make it feel like it's a brand new house all the time. Typically, I recommend if you're going to list a property, you want to keep the continuity throughout the house because it's easier for buyers to say, hey, a lot of this is updated or none of it's updated, and we can find a value somewhere in between. If you start piecemealing things along the way, it almost stands out even more. If everything else is dated, but then there's this spa retreat primary bathroom, it almost makes the rest of the house feel worse because that is what could be. And buyers have a tough time getting past that mentally. So there's very few things I would say on the front end that are an absolute must, especially if you know that there's a lot of things buyers would change anyway. It's usually easier to just do credits. Now, one thing that does get a decent return, especially if you're in a competitive market or things are a little bit slower, is you want to steam clean the carpets. You potentially want to do some fresh coats of paint on the walls, trim, baseboards. Get the house professionally cleaned before listing it. In my mind, those things that help set the tone, even the landscaping out front where a buyer sees that first, you want to convey a positive image going in and as they're walking through, and then it becomes a little bit easier for them to start assigning value to the rest of the house. But if they're going through something that's not updated and the carpets are all shredded, or it smells, or the paint is old and peeling, it's just going to really reek like a fixer-upper rather than something that has a lot of potential for them. Same thing on the higher end side. I've seen a lot of luxury homes where they just look like they have a ton of wear and tear, and the buyers can't bring themselves to get to what the home is actually worth. And in those instances, the sellers would have spent a lot less just doing that work on the front end than they lost out having to do price reductions and ultimately lower negotiations with the buyer. Rideshare incentives, this is something I haven't actually considered on any of my condo listings, especially the ones in Atlanta, but it is a pretty unique idea of just, there are a lot of buildings where parking is extremely limited. So preloading a Uber or Lyft credit for somebody for a year, giving them Park Mobile, something to get around, that is unique. I haven't seen anyone ask for it on any of my listings, but it's something I would definitely consider. But part of that is about the conversation with your agent. If you're in an area where it's densely populated, there's a lot of condos, what is the immediate walkability? Maybe you're right on the outside of a transitioning area where it doesn't yet have all the businesses coming in that buyers would want right outside. And then the ride shares make a lot more sense. You're giving them that opportunity to go do all the things they want to do and not have to worry about that car aspect. Sellers leaving furnishings, number 12. Now, this is something we see all the time. We address this through a bill of sale. Try to do any furnishings outside the contract because it can mess up a lot of the underwriting and loans depending on what the verbiage is in the special stipulations of the contract. A lot of times, especially if owners have fantastic taste or really well staged homes, buyers are going to see that and they're going to think, hey, this is way better than I can do it. I just want to take it as is. So they'll either offer to buy the furniture separately, take the house fully furnished. There may be a piece here or there. So as an owner, especially if you have some family heirlooms or pieces that are very important to you, I would make a list on the front end and just kind of send that along with the disclosures to all the scheduled showings and make it well known that, hey, we appreciate all the wonderful feedback. These items aren't actually available, and we'd love to just negotiate for the house itself and kind of just get that out of the way to not have someone fall in love with some fantastic sofa in the living room and then they miss the forest for the trees because they can't buy the house, or mentally they can't bring themselves to get a deal done because you don't want to get rid of that sofa or other piece of furniture. It happens more than you think. I've actually had somebody ask for the owner's pet in the contract because the pet was there during the showing and they loved the dog so much. Super weird stuff, but when it comes to buying homes, sometimes people can just be a little bit irrational. Now, moving assistance, this is sometimes a little tricky just because a lot of times if people are relocating, they may be in the middle of a transition themselves. I find moving costs aren't necessarily something buyers think about on the front end when thinking about how much they can afford of the home. I would rather probably see this be a closing cost credit or an upfront credit that the buyers can feel immediately to get the deal done, rather than something that they're gonna feel after closing, where you still would have had to go through all the negotiation anyway. I don't know a whole lot of instances unless you're trying to entice someone from overseas or that is relocating to your state that may be a little bit less familiar. Then I could potentially see covering some of those costs the way businesses do for relocating their workers. But for the most part, I would just tie this into closing costs. Credit for an expedited closing. This is a unique idea that I actually liked. Now, when it comes to selling real estate, the biggest challenge for agents is extended closings. And I know there's tons of instances where sellers want time to get out of the house. They potentially want occupancy post-closing, which creates all sorts of legal issues. But if you're trying to make a transition happen as quickly as possible, and maybe you're trying to buy another house, you need this domino to fall so you can go and move and buy the next one, that may make a lot more sense to just say, hey, I will go ahead and give you this credit. We're trying to get this closed in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, instead of that 30 days. Because every day that extends for the closing, more and more can go wrong, and you are at risk of the contract just falling apart. We've had a lot of contracts actually terminate and fall apart within 48 hours of closing. So every day you push back is just a risk that something else could go wrong, whether it be an act of God or just something on the buyer's side. Unique concessions, I would personally shy away from this. They're talking about potentially offering a vacation package, or we see the gimmicks of a car on a luxury property. Buyers are going to fall in love with the house and the house itself. They're not necessarily going to fall in love with all those add-ons. And I've never seen somebody buy a house because of something additional non-house related that's being offered. You're much more likely that they're going to want the furniture or some amenity of the home to stay or be added, rather than that vacation that they can just take themselves. And honestly, they would probably rather do it their way. 16, concessions to the buyer's agent. So we touched on this a little bit earlier in the closing cost credit. This is just that you have to decide on the front end how much, if any, you want to offer a buyer's agent, or if you're relying solely on the buyer paying that buyer's agent. Now, as a seller, you have the full right either way. In Georgia, we've been a buyer broker state since the 90s. So we've actually always been that way, where the buyer's agent is compensated directly by the buyer. But we have had co-op offerings being given by the sellers over the years, which makes it feel like the buyers aren't actually paying because the seller is covering those fees. So it is something to note as a seller. Whatever you offer is helping to entice people into the home. The more money that is going to be beneficial to them and less out of pocket, where they don't have to pay an agent, may make it a little bit more likely that they're interested in your house, that they can actually get the deal to work. And it's just something to think about and talk with your agent about what you're seeing in your local market and what may be the best approach. I personally, whenever I'm listing a house, I try and figure out and I'm talking about my personal homes, I try and figure out what the norm is for my area. And I don't really want to discount that on the front end, because I'm trying to cast as wide of a net to get people through the door as possible, because that will ultimately get me my higher sales price. I know, just based on doing this over the years, the more I try and pay less on the front end to the agent side, usually ends up netting a lower sales price ultimately than I would have got from an agent just bringing the buyer and negotiating less on that front. So overall, I think it's a decent list. I think there's a few items that would definitely focus more on, like closing costs, handling the inspections a little bit differently, thinking about some HOA fees being prepaid, how to handle upgrades, but really focusing on curb appeal and setting the tone for your house to shine when it's on the market. So if anything's really going to be done, I would just encourage you to talk to your agent and figure out what are the other houses in the neighborhood or area doing that are getting low days on market and high sales price to list price ratios, because that's ultimately what you're looking for. You're looking for the highest sales price to your list price and potentially lower days on market. So that way, you know, you're able to move and get more money in your pocket at the end of the day. But as always, if you found this content valuable, please like and subscribe. If you have any questions about selling your home, whether you're in Greater Atlanta or anywhere else, I'm happy to answer them the best I can. I have colleagues all over the world that I send referrals to back and forth, and we would love to be of service to you. Thanks so much.